that's becoming sort of a litmus test almost in the primary. So it's interesting how they are trying to find their feet. They obviously want to keep Trump's supporters on side, given he can demand, or he sort of dominates between 20 and 40% of the Republican base, but also distinguish themselves because they are also trying to win the nomination. So if they're always going to be supporting him, how do they make that case?
That's the dilemma, right? Is that they want to be somewhat deferential to Trump because that seems to be where the base of the party is. But if you're running against Trump, don't you at some point have to run against Trump? Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by White House reporter Naomi Lim. Now, Naomi, you ventured out of the White House for a nice beach vacation. Well, maybe not. So you were in Miami when former President Donald Trump was arraigned. He's facing federal charges. Set the scene a little bit for us.
Yeah, so I've just returned from Miami, where the president, was the first former sitting president to be arrested and arraigned on federal criminal charges. Right. And I think what really struck me is that this is an unprecedented moment, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the campaign, the former president, his staff also seemed sort of more rehearsed because they've done it before. They did it in the spring when Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg also indicted the former president again on criminal charges there. Right. And so it just seemed to me like, this is all unprecedented, but we've been through this before. And so I kind of am wondering whether, there'll be a sense of sort of desensitization to this, not only from Trump supporters, but also the public at large. I think what was really striking to me is that there were sort of really concerns about security in the lead up to it because it was a very soft target. It's a courthouse that's made of glass, sure. and wasn't particularly secured. It was just had police tape around it, but only a couple of hundred Trump supporters turned out. And talking to them, it was really interesting. Obviously, there were huge characters. One dressed up as Uncle Sam, one had like a pig's head on a stake. Mm-hmm. But talking to the quieter Trump supporters, just to figure out, why it was important for them to turn up and what they sort of made of the federal investigation was really interesting. And something that kind of struck me was that there's an understanding, like they support the president, right. And there's an understanding that he's sort of been attacked. Maybe that's too strong of a word by the federal government.
You feel he's been unfairly targeted.
Treated, like
right.
Double standard weaponization of the government, to use taglines from conservatives in DC. But there's also sort of like this open-mindedness where they think that because this trial will take place in Miami, which is overwhelmingly, at least this past couple of election cycles, more Republican than not, right. And by a Trump-appointed judge, that'll be a more fair process, as opposed to if it were to happen in Virginia or DC, which is where a grand jury heard a lot of the evidence that Special Counsel Jack Smith will bring in the case.
Right, and a lot of people felt that the previous indictment was very much a product of the venue being New York.
Exactly. And so it'll be interesting to see how it processes. It'll now change, so it was heard by a federal magistrate judge, the first initial appearance. It will now sort of progress. We're seeing already Judge Eileen Cannon asking for the lawyers involved in the case to get security clearances and indicating that this timeline will be quite fast, which is something that she has the power to do. She can delay the tactic, which would, work out in Trump's advantage as we head into not only the primary season, but potentially if he is the nominee into the general election. So it's sort of waiting and seeing, but we'll see how it sort of plays out over the coming weeks, maybe years. Hopefully not.
Maybe years. But you mentioned a very interesting dynamic in that not only is he a former president, but he is a leading candidate to potentially become president again. How has his indictment affected, if at all, the race, at least for the Republican nomination?
I know, I feel like this is a story in like 3 stages because initially when we sort of learnt that he was, one, the target of this federal investigation, then he was being indicted, I think a lot of the reactions were, again, talking about this weaponization of the government, that it was unfair, that it's sort of a double standard. Then we sort of got the indictment got unsealed, and it's sort of like this very long, people refer to it as a speaking indictment where it's so particular detailed. There are photographs of these documents beside bathrooms and beside toilets, and it seemed quite damning. And so the the focus then changed the national security aspect of it. You had someone like former United Nations Ambassador Nikki Haley sort of saying, you know, my husband's about to deploy overseas and this is how our former commander-in-chief handled classified documents.
Right.
And then you sort of saw that because I think former Attorney General Will Barr sort of said, you know, Trump looks like he's toast. I think that kind of opened the gates for these other candidates.
Former Trump Attorney General.
Exactly,
right.
exactly. And so you had like even former Vice President Mike Pence sort of saying, you know, my son's also I think a Marine, and so again that argument. But then it kind of changed again, where you had this idea of whether the former president should be pardoned if these Republican candidates were not just candidates but then became president. And I think that's becoming sort of a litmus test almost in the primary. So it's interesting how they are trying to find their feet. They obviously want to keep Trump's supporters on side, given he can demand or he sort of dominates between 20 and 40% of the Republican base, but also distinguish themselves because they are also trying to win the nomination. So if they're always going to be supporting him, how do they make that case?
That's the dilemma, right? Is that they want to be somewhat deferential to Trump because that seems to be where the base of the party is. But if you're running against Trump, don't you at some point have to run against Trump?
Exactly, and so we're seeing a couple of people be a little bit more strident in their criticism. Asa Hutchinson, the former Arkansas governor, I mean, he's polling in 1%, less than 1%, but we sort of also saw former New Jersey governor Chris Christie make the same sort of case more recently, and so whether that's something that catches on, we'll see. I mean, people always talk about whether the debates will be this defining moment, but if Trump doesn't turn up to debate, I don't know how that will work, if that will be as effective as some people think it will be. But yeah, it's just a terrible, I mean, it must be terrible to be a presidential hopeful and having to run against Donald Trump because he just creates so much like conundrums in terms of how you know, you can win the White House.
You know, people who live in glass courthouses shouldn't throw stones.
Exactly.
Thank you, Naomi. You can read Naomi and the rest of our political team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.